Creek Church family. How good was that song? Isn't that awesome? Man, all right, not as good as I thought. All right, good. Thank you. Really thankful for our worship team. Actually, can you just make sure they hear you thanking them real quick for all that they do? Really appreciate them. Well, it's really good to be together once again. If you're watching us on our live stream, thanks for joining us. And if you happen to be new to us this morning, I just want to say a special welcome to you. My name's Todd. If I haven't met you, I would love the opportunity to meet you. And this week, we are starting really a brand new, we're continuing a series we started last week. It's week 2 of a 3-week mini-series called Next Door. And the whole premise of this series is really closely knit to the vision of Silver Creek, or a big part of the vision of Silver Creek, and that's this, that we want to be the kind of church that doesn't just gather here in this building and expect a lot of people to just show up here in order to understand who Jesus is, but that we're the kind of church that takes Jesus from here out to the places that we live, starting with the people that live right next door. It's the whole point of this series. Now, if you were to have somebody come up to you and say, where do you go to church? You would say Silver Creek Church, and then they'd say, well, where is Silver Creek Church? And you would give them the address. It would look something like this. You'd pull up a map. This is where Silver Creek Church is. 252 North Chillicothe Road, Aurora, Ohio, 44202. Right on 306, right across from the golf course, right? And that's what we would say. Now, I think that's an okay answer, but I actually don't think it's the best answer. This is the building that we gather in, but church is a bit different than just the building that we gathered in. If somebody came to me and said, hey, where's Silver Creek Church? I would actually put a map up like this, right? This is where Silver Creek Church is, because we spend the majority of our days away from this building, but God still has a mission for you and me. Some of you are looking for your house right now or your neighborhood. But listen, the point is this, that God has a mission right where you're at. And I love this because if you look at that map, we have a greater mission than we can even imagine. Because everywhere we go is where God has placed us so that people would hear about Jesus. That's really the heartbeat of this whole series and really the heartbeat of what we want to be as a church. So this week, we're going to be in a different passage, but I wanted to start off this particular sermon with having you finish this sentence, all right? Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. All right, everybody knows that if you watch TV. If you don't watch TV, that's good for you. That is a great slogan, and it's not just great because it's easy to remember, it's great because it's meaningful. If you're talking about an insurance company, when you call State Farm, you're calling them, you're most likely going through something very difficult, right? Because you're making an insurance claim, and they're saying, in your most difficult days, we'll be there. And that's not something that just like Jake from State Farm says. That's actually something that actually Jesus says to each of us, that we would be the kind of people that in others' most difficult days, we would be the ones who are there. Jesus talked about this in Luke chapter 10. So if you have a Bible that you'd like to open to Luke chapter 10, you can do so. That's where we're going to anchor today. Also, we have these blue Bibles under seats. If you're looking for a Bible to use, you may use this. If you don't have a Bible and would like to take one home with you, just take this one. No one's going to chase you down in the parking lot. These are gifts to you. We'd love for you to have it. And of course, you can follow along on the screen as we go about this. Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. And there are 2 points that I want to give you about this passage. I know, just 2, not 3. But here they are. There's first the context, then the barriers. The context and then the barriers. The context of neighboring well and the barriers that keep us from neighboring well. So here we go. First is the context. Verse 25. Let's take a look. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test. That's Jesus. Saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? All right, first thing I want to say is this. When it's talking about a lawyer, it's not talking about a lawyer like we would think like an attorney would be. What this guy is an expert in the law of God. He's actually a Bible expert or an Old Testament law expert. So essentially, this is like a religious leader that he is talking to, or you could say a Jewish Bible expert. Now, the man comes and he asks a really important question that all of us should be asking, right? And that's this: what must I do to inherit eternal life? It's a great question. But this particular man was asking the question with a different motive. You see it there? He says he stood up and asked him this question to put him to a test. He wanted to test him. And so what this guy was doing is he knew Jesus was claiming to be the Son of God, speaking for God, but he was also hanging around some really shady people. Like there were disciples that weren't very religious that he was hanging around with. There were women that had like a sketchy past that he was hanging around with all these people. And this Bible expert is going, this guy can't really be from God because look who he's hanging out with. What he was trying to do is catch him saying the wrong answer to this question, how do you inherit eternal life? So that he could call him a blasphemer and so that they could kind of cancel him. But it's not really the way it happened. Verse 26. Jesus responded to this man, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." All right, so Jesus brilliantly answers this guy's question, should I do to inherit eternal life, with another question. And the question is this: well, you're the Bible expert, so tell us, what do you think? What does it say in the Bible? And this guy says, well, here's what it says. And he sums up all the Old Testament law with two commands. And these might be familiar to some of you, but he says, love the Lord your God, right, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all your strength, and with all of your mind. And then love your neighbor as yourself. This is the answer. Now, this sounds really good. Those two things are really important for us to know. And it sounds really good to say, love your neighbor, or love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. That's a great thing. But let me ask you a question. How many of you feel like this past week, the entire week, you were really good at loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind? All of it, right? That is challenging, right? Not many of us would be like, yeah, I feel really confident about that. I wouldn't be the one. It's really a tall order that this guy is suggesting. And then the second thing is it says, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's also really hard because it's not just saying love your neighbor, it's love your neighbor as yourself. Essentially what he's saying is we are called to meet the needs of our neighbor just like we meet our own needs. And think about that. Like every day we wake up and we meet our own needs very naturally. Right? We get the food we need, we have the clothes we need, the shelter, the emotional needs that we have. We are always meeting our needs, and it comes very naturally to us. Love your neighbor as yourself is that you would meet the needs of your neighbor in the same way that you meet your own needs. Right? Wow, this is a really challenging two commandments. All right, so let's take a look though at what Jesus says next. He said to the law expert, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Right? He's like, hey, good answer. Go do that and live. And I pictured Jesus at this point starting to walk away. He's like, that's the answer. So go ahead, do that and you'll live. And the guy is like, wait, hold on a second. And all of a sudden it's like the script is flipped because this guy came to test Jesus, and now Jesus is asking him questions and telling him things that are testing him. And so he comes back, verse 29, and he has another question for him. It says, "But he," the law expert, the Bible expert, "desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" Now, this was a question, remember, desiring to justify himself. All of a sudden, this man goes, wait, if that's what I need to do to have eternal life, then I need to know if I'm doing this well. And in this guy's mind, he's going, there are neighbors that I do love, but then there are some that aren't very lovable. So, Jesus, who is my neighbor? Tell me there's some people that kind of I have an out with, that I don't have to love like that. And to answer the question, Jesus tells one of the most famous parables that we know. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. Right? I want to read this whole parable, and then we're going to really spend the majority of our time talking about it. Verse 30, Jesus replied, here's the parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Jesus says, which of the 3 do you think proved to be the neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And Jesus said, or the law expert said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. All right, so that's the story. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at this story and find out barriers that are in the way of us loving our neighbor the way Jesus has called us to love our neighbor. So that moves us from the context, point 1, now to the barriers. And there are 3 barriers that you see in this passage that keep us from loving our neighbors well, and we're going to talk about how to break through those. Okay, so first, the very first barrier is the cost. The cost. Now, what I want you to know is that if you're going to love your neighbors well, if you're going to be the neighbor that Jesus wants you to be, it is going to cost you something. It's going to be hard. And that's the first thing. Now, let me recap this story real quickly. So there's a man who is taking a little journey from Jerusalem all the way to Jericho. The first thing we know about this story is that this man is most likely a Jewish man, just like the guy interacting with Jesus, because he's coming from Jerusalem, from Israel, and so that means he was a Jew. He was going to Jericho, so keep that in mind. He's on this road, and he gets mugged and beaten and robbed and left half dead on the side of the road. All right? 3 different people walk by this guy. It's like the start of, a bad joke. Like, there were 3 men walked into a bar. The first one's always a priest. This one's a priest. I don't know. But anyway, 3 men that walked by this half-dead guy on the side of the road. The first guy is a priest. And what happens with the priest is that he looks at the guy dead on the side of the road. He moves all the way to the other side and walks by. Now, there's a couple reasons scholars say that a priest would definitely walk by. One is that he's a priest, and this guy was half dead, but he looked full dead. And so this guy's going, if this guy's dead, then I can't touch him because I will be then deemed unclean. It's not kosher for me to touch anything that's dead. So he's like, whoa, I don't want to mess with this. The other thing that you need to know about this road from Jerusalem to Jericho is that it was notoriously known for being a road where you would get robbed and mugged, especially if you were by yourself. For whatever reason, the road, the way it was set up, it was easy for people to rob other people and mug them on that road. So for the priest or for anyone to stop to help this guy who was hurting half dead on the side of the road, you would have made yourself vulnerable. So it could have been that this half dead guy was actually bait so that someone else would come out of the woods and mug you and rob you. So it was really risky to try to help this guy. So the priest passes on by. Next guy comes up. He's the Levite, does the exact same thing, passes on by. Now here's the thing about the Levite. The Levite is supposed to be the group of people in the temple that actually cared for the poor and the struggling and the hurting. So it's really interesting. It's ironic that the Levite also just passes by. So just make sure this is clear. 2 Jewish leaders in the temple pass by a half-dead Jewish guy on the road. Okay? Next guy comes up is a Samaritan. The Samaritan finally has compassion on this half-dead man. What does he do? He bandages up his wounds. He pours oil and wine into them, which would probably hurt, but would heal, and it would help him. And then he put him on his animal, and then he took him to an inn, and he stayed overnight to make sure it was good. He paid the guy a couple denarii just so that he would be able to take care of him at the inn, and then said, whatever else I owe you, I will pay you back. And you have to ask yourself a question. So this is a parable. And a parable is a story that teaches. It's not an actual real story that happened. So one of the questions you might ask is, why did Jesus put so much detail about how this man cared for him? All the detail. And I think the reason that he did is because he wanted to show us how much it cost to really love our neighbor as we love ourselves. It costs a lot. So I want to go back and listen to what he did. First of all, he had compassion. He stopped. He probably had a schedule to fulfill. He was going to Jericho for a reason, but he dropped everything and cared for the man. He got down on his hands and knees. He got dirty. He probably got really bloody. All for this man. It already is costing him something. Then he took the most expensive things that he had on his person, which were wine and oil, and he used them to actually heal this guy's wounds. He poured them out for this guy. And then he puts him on his animal, which meant that this guy could no longer ride his animal, which would have probably got him there faster and expending less energy because he put the half-dead guy on the animal. Takes him to the inn, pays for his health care at the inn, and then it looks like he even stays overnight because the next day he left and he goes, hey, I'll pay back whatever else I owe. I mean, it cost this guy something at every turn to love this half-dead man. And I think that's what Jesus wants to show you in this, is to love your neighbor as yourself is to care for someone holistically, like every part of their needs, like you would want to be cared for yourself. That's why I love this passage. It's really challenging. And what he's saying is, if you're going to be the kind of neighbor Jesus calls you to be, it's going to cost you something. And I would even say, based on this passage, if loving your neighbor doesn't cost you anything, even just your time or your priorities, then you may not be loving them like Christ wants you to love them. Now, I have to say this, I don't have this down. I don't have this down. This is a hard thing. But Jillian and I, 3 years ago, when we moved to Aurora, we really prayed that God would bring us to a neighborhood where he would give us an opportunity to love people well for the purpose of sharing Jesus with them. And he brought us to this neighborhood that happened to be like super social, which is good. Some of you are in neighborhoods where, like, if you try to like go up to someone, they think you're creepy and weird. Like, this is not our neighborhood. Our neighborhood does little events and social gatherings and stuff. So we had this opportunity to kind of connect with a lot of different people. And my wife is so much better at taking relationships deeper. And so she started getting to know some ladies, started to ask them more questions about their lives, even take opportunity to begin to meet some small, tangible needs from time to time for them. And I want you to see this because, and I'm bragging on my wife for a minute, because she opened up opportunity to begin to share Christ with neighbors. And it's been really, really a cool thing. And that's what happens when you just meet the tangible needs of your neighbor. They begin to see Jesus and go, why are you doing this? And then you begin to have an opportunity to tell them why. Fast forward to this past year, my wife was approached by another lady in the neighborhood who goes to a different church. And she said, hey, let's start a Bible study. And so they ended up starting a Bible study. My wife is leading a Bible study. They started inviting people, anybody and everyone. They now have about 12 to 13 ladies who meet every other Monday night going through a study together. There are ladies that go to this church that are in it, but there are also ladies that don't go to church or go to a different church. Some ladies that are just discovering Jesus for the first time. Some that are saying, hey, does anybody have a Bible I could have? I've never really opened a Bible. It is amazing to see the opportunities she has just because she went out of her way to meet some needs. And it costs her something. She's a full-time mom with 4 kids. She works part-time. But it costs you something. But man, does it pay off. All right. So the first one is the cost. That's the first barrier. The second is the person. We all know people. A lot of us are really great people that love to meet the needs of others. We have some great people in this church. But sometimes we look at certain neighbors and we go, I love meeting the needs of people, but not that neighbor. Like, you know what I mean? Everybody's got that one neighbor that's maybe a little more difficult for you. Maybe that neighbor who's just awkward and really difficult and they always bring up awkward subjects. Or maybe it's the guy who called the city on you because your tree is like hanging over his yard and it shouldn't be, or whatever. Maybe it's the family whose dogs wake you up at like 6 a.m. Maybe it's the one with the political sign that's the opposite of whatever your political stance is. But whatever it is, we all have those neighbors. And you might be asking, well, I will love my neighbor as myself, but do I have to love that neighbor? What if they're not lovable? It's the same question the law expert was actually asking Jesus. He says, who is my neighbor, to justify himself? Because he was trying to say, wait a second, if someone is really not lovable, do I have to love them? And Jesus answers with this story. And the story is really pretty brilliant. There's a couple things I want to point out about this story that I think will help you. It helped me. The first is this. Remember what I said earlier? The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notorious for being a really dangerous road. And so when Jesus started to tell this story, the Bible expert he was talking to and anyone else that was listening would have been like, no, not that road. He goes, a man went down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and they're like, what an idiot. Everybody knows you don't travel that road. Like every night on the evening news, you watch another guy got mugged on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. It happens all the time. So the people who are listening are already dismissing this guy. They're going, oh, this guy is seriously stupid. No one, whatever happens to him next, he's got it coming to them. Got it coming to him. Because no one should ever travel that road. But isn't this kind of the way we respond sometimes to that one neighbor? Where we go, you know, nobody can help that guy because that guy just needs to help himself first. You know, I can't help him. I'm not going to reach out to him because look, he's digging his own grave. Right? But that's the person that Jesus is talking about in this passage. The next thing he does is he says this. Hey, this person, the person who helps the half-dead guy is a Samaritan. Why would Jesus make the hero of the story a Samaritan? And for people to hear him tell this story, they would have been like shocked. Because if you know anything about Samaritans and Jews, they hated each other. Back in this day, they could not be more polar opposites. Samaritans couldn't stand Jews. Jews couldn't stand Samaritans. Everything that a Jew stood for, a Samaritan was completely against it. Everything that a Samaritan stood for, a Jew was completely against it. I mean, it was polar opposites. So the question is, why did Jesus do that? And I was trying to think of how to make you feel this, because we weren't back in that day, so it doesn't like mean that much to us when I say that. So I was thinking there's a couple different things. First, I could tell the story like this. So there was a Steelers fan laying dead on the side of the road, right? And terrible towel and everything. And, and Pastor Todd walks by. I would help even a Steelers fan that was half dead. But listen, as I tell that story, you begin to think, oh, if it's a Browns fan and if he's had enough to drink, who knows? Like, he may finish the guy off, right, if he's half dead. And that's funny, and I believe like that's an okay example, but it's not a great example. So I think there's a better example. In 2024, we're the most polar opposite people right now that can't stand each other. Well, it's the extreme right and it's the extreme left, right? And so telling the story like this, and I'm going to make you a little uncomfortable for a moment, okay? There's a half-dead man on the side of the road. He's got a MAGA hat on and a Trump 2024 t-shirt on, right? Guy, yes, it's uncomfortable. Guy comes along, that's the Good Samaritan. He's got, a Biden 2024 reelect shirt on. right? You could turn it around. You could switch places. But do you feel it now? Like, do you feel how polarizing this would have been for Jesus to share a story like that? Like I said, it could be the other way around. The Biden guy could be half dead and the Trump guy could be walking along. And the reason I say that is because I'm not making a political statement. I'm simply saying, do you understand how polarizing this would be for Jesus to tell a story like this? And the question is, why? Why did he share a story with two people that were so polar opposites? And I believe the answer is this, that for us to be the kind of neighbor Jesus wants us to be, we will meet the needs of anyone and everyone, no matter what they believe, no matter what they stand for, even if they stand for something that is so polar opposite of what we stand for. Our calling is to love them and to meet their needs, because that's what Jesus said. I think that's what we get out of this. Now, I want to tell you another story of a friend of mine. There was a friend of mine who told this story about her neighbor. She has this neighbor who just hasn't been real nice. And, you know, this friend of mine has dogs, and the dogs sometimes bark, and the guy doesn't really like it at all. And so he, will come out and kind of almost be intimidating. I think one time maybe had like a baseball bat, like, put those dogs in or whatever. And that's intimidating. That's not a great neighbor, right? And this friend of mine was saying, I was talking to some of my friends, and they were saying, hey, you should call the police about that guy. That's wrong. And I love what my friend did, because she said, you know what? I'm going to respond. I'm going to try something different first. And what she did is she made some cookies or made some food. She brought the food over to the man, said, hey, I'm really sorry about the dogs. They're barking a lot, and I get it. I'm sorry about that. But I wanted to bring you these cookies because I realized, I don't really know you that well. And started asking questions about this guy and getting to know this guy. And this guy was taken aback. He's like, what is going on right now? You have no reason to be this kind to me. But now this relationship is beginning to form. And it's all because my friend thought, you know what? This guy, everybody in the world is saying this guy is polar opposite of me. This guy's not worth me doing this for. But I got to see him differently. I got to love him like Jesus loves. And I love that example. I think it's a great example for all of us. That one neighbor that is really hard for you might actually be just the neighbor that needs you the most right now. And Jesus says that's your neighbor. All right? Now, that leads me to the last point, which is not only is the cost a barrier and the person sometimes a barrier, but the motive. The motive is a barrier too. And what I want to say today as we close is this, that you will not reach your neighbors for Jesus unless you have the right motives. This is important. And we see this in this passage. So I asked this question earlier, but I want to ask it again. One of the questions when you read this is, why in the world did Jesus make the Samaritan the hero of the story? If I were, because it seems like this, it seems like he's trying to get the Jewish law expert to be a better neighbor. So if you're getting the Jewish guy to be a better neighbor, I would say something like this. Hey, let me tell you a story. There was a Jewish man, Bible expert even, walking on the road down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And there was a half-dead Samaritan on the side of the road. And can you believe it? Even though Jews really can't stand Samaritans, this guy had compassion on him. He stopped and he helped him and he bandaged up his wounds and he took him in and he brought him, got him back to health. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing what somebody like you could do for somebody else? And it would be like an inspiring story. But that's not what Jesus did. And I think it's because of this. Jesus didn't want the guy to try harder to be a better neighbor. Jesus didn't want the guy to identify with the hero of the story. And he doesn't want you and I to either. Jesus wanted this guy to identify not with the Samaritan or the hero, but with the half-dead guy on the side of the road. That's who he wanted this guy to get in the shoes of. And here's why. Because you and I, we will not be the kind of neighbor Jesus wants us to be until we realize that we were once half dead on the side of the road. No hope, no purpose, no identity, no belonging. But Jesus came for us. Right? That's the gospel. And that's what Jesus wanted this guy to know. You can't try harder. You've got to trust in the righteousness of Jesus. If you and I want to be a better neighbor, if we want to have the right motives to reach our neighbor, we have to realize that Jesus first came and reached us. If we want to meet the needs of our neighbor, we have to first realize that Jesus has come to us to meet the deepest possible need that we could ever have. And that is to move us from death to life, through his death, through his resurrection. And it begins to completely change your motives for being the neighbor God calls you to be. Romans 5:6-8 says, "For while we were still weak, while we were half dead on the side of the road, at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." So what I think Jesus wants us to see in this story is that Jesus left his throne in heaven to come down to move into your neighborhood, to be the neighbor that you didn't even know you needed. The neighbor that would do for you what you couldn't do for yourself, and giving his life on your behalf. And it's not until you recognize you are the half-dead guy who had no hope, but Jesus gave you hope by taking your sin, putting it on his shoulders and dying for it, and then rising again to prove that it all was true. Listen, I think Jesus is saying to us today, if you've received the undeserved mercy of Jesus, then you have to give it to others. It cost him everything. He didn't do it for the people he liked. He did it for the people that were his enemies. He did it for the worst of us. And it was all because he loved us. So my question is, for all of us today, is the same question Jesus asked, the same questions that's asked in here. Who is my neighbor? Who is your neighbor? I think what Jesus is saying is anyone who has a need that you have the means to fulfill. And if that person pops into your mind right now, that is your neighbor. That's your neighbor. We're going to close with communion this morning, and I think communion is a fantastic opportunity to get the right motives, especially after a sermon like this one. And here's why we love communion. Communion was given to us by Jesus himself, and it was supposed to be the way that we would remember the cross of Jesus, his death. The bread would be a symbol of his body broken for us. The cup would be a symbol of his blood shed on our behalf. And then by taking it, we would remember Jesus and his death. And it should remind us of two things. One is who we were before Jesus gave his life for us. That we were hopeless, that we had no identity, we had no purpose. But that Jesus took our sin on his shoulders so that we could be forgiven forever and come back into a relationship with him. And it is with that motivation that we should begin to have a heart to reach our neighbors. 1 Corinthians 11:26 says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Communion should get us on mission. So spend some time reflecting now on what Jesus has done for you so that you go from here and offer that same mercy to others. We're going to take communion. That means we come up front. We have stations in front of each of the sections. We ask that you would start in the front, exit your row to the right, grab both cups stacked on top of each other, and then come back around to your left and have a seat. Spend some time in reflection, and when you're ready, you can go ahead and just take the elements on your own. Now let's stand and take it together now.